All right, and welcome while we start to read about General Ulysses S. Grant, the General in Chief of the Union Army. Not at the beginning, obviously, because you had Burnside, you had Hooker, you had these all these preceding generals that Lincoln, well, yeah, McClellan. You had all these guys that Lincoln was just like, please attack, please go attack. And if they did, they were so timid about it, they usually failed. And that's not Grant. So Grant, from March 10th, 1864 to March 4th, 1869, was the general in chief of the Union armies, meaning he did not start out at the beginning of the war as the top general. He was made the top general later on because Lincoln wanted a fighting general. That's who Grant was. So Ulysses Grant commanded the victorious Union Army during the American Civil War and served also as the 18th U.S. president after the Civil War from 1869 to 1877. In 1839, Ulysses' father arranged for his admission to the U.S. Military Academy at West Point. The congressman who appointed Grant mistakenly believed that his first name was Ulysses and his middle name was Simpson, his mother's maiden name. His birth name was actually Hiram Ulysses Grant. Grant never amended the error and went on to accept Ulysses S. Grant as his real name. When asked about it, he said, "Find some name beginning with S for me," he joked in an 1844 letter to his future wife, Julia Dent. "You know I have an S in my name, and I don't know what it stands for," because the college just messed it up on accident, and he never corrected it. After the Civil War began in 1861, in April, Grant became a colonel in the 21st Illinois Volunteers. Later that summer, President Abraham Lincoln made Grant a brigadier general. Grant won the first major Union victory of the war in February 1862 when his troops captured Fort Donelson in Tennessee. When the Confederate general in charge of the fort asked for terms of surrender, Grant famously replied, "No terms, except an unconditional and immediate surrender can be accepted." For many, from that point on, Grant's initials would no longer stand for Ulysses Simpson, but rather unconditional surrender. In July of 1863, Grant's forces capture Vicksburg, Mississippi, a Confederate stronghold. Grant, who was earning a reputation as a tenacious and determined leader, was appointed a lieutenant general by Lincoln on March 10th, 1864, and then given command over all U.S. armies, making him the general in chief. He led a series of campaigns that ultimately wore down the Confederate Army and helped bring the deadliest conflict in U.S. history to a close, the Civil War. On April 9th, 1865, Confederate General Robert E. Lee surrendered to Grant at Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia, effectively ending the Civil War, because all the Southern troops everywhere looked at Lee as their beloved commander. And if Lee surrenders, everyone else surrenders. Grant knew this, which is why he pressed Lee so hard. When a group of congressmen earlier in the war had once alleged that Grant was drunk and then complained to President Lincoln about it, President Lincoln asked what kind of whiskey Grant preferred. Lincoln later said, "For if it made fighting generals like Grant, I should like to get some of it for distribution." Basically, what was really going on is Grant was a huge drunk, always getting drunk. In fact, his secretary was the guy who basically saved Grant, because when they were actually fighting, the secretary guy would not let Grant drink the way he wanted to drink. And Grant was an amazing general as long as he was sober. Sometimes he still got drunk anyways. And so a lot of congressmen were like, "We can't have think about the children and the women reading in the newspapers. They'll find out that one of our generals that's out there murdering and killing people drinks alcohol." And Lincoln says, "Well, if it wins battles, find out what kind of whiskey he drinks, and I'll give it to everybody, because I want to win battles." It's kind of funny. On April 14th, Lincoln was assassinated by John Wilkes Booth while attending a play at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. Grant and his wife had originally been invited, but they were visiting family, and Grant regretted not attending the theater that night for the rest of his life because Grant believed that if he had been there, that somehow he could have saved Lincoln's life. I hope you're learning, and I hope that you're having fun.